Hello and welcome to our webinar, Financially Preparing for the Cost of Long-Term Care. My name is Ronnie Meldrum and this is my team here on the screen. We help people protect their retirement assets from the very biggest expense in retirement, which is healthcare and long-term care. We specialize in long-term care financing strategies, including Medicaid long-term care. Our agenda today will learn what long-term care is and about the types of facilities available, how much they cost. We'll discuss the different ways long-term care is typically paid for. We'll go over how Medicaid and Medicare are different. We'll learn about the role that Medicare plays in long-term care. We'll talk about the Medicaid spend down. We'll discuss how different insurance strategies are used when financing long-term care, including its use in Medicaid planning. And finally, we'll dive a bit deeper into how Medicaid long-term care works. So what is long-term care? Long-term care is a term for care that people sometimes need as they age to help them safely get throughout the day. So we get to the point in life when simply getting up out of bed, heading into the bathroom, getting up and down from the toilet, continence, showering, dressing, and feeding ourselves, or what we call activities of daily living, are no longer simple. If your loved one needs help with two of these activities, this help is considered custodial care, or more commonly, long-term care. People who have cognitive impairment like dementia or Alzheimer's are also in need of custodial care because safety becomes the primary concern. Many types of facilities provide long-term care, and the more care or activities that you need assistance with, the more it will cost. Skilled nursing facility is the most expensive because it's staffed 24 hours a day with skilled licensed nurses. Average cost is about $500 a day. Assisted living facility has limited care, and the average cost is $267 per day. Memory care is a specialized facility where safety and security are really the primary concern. The patient can walk around no problem, but they are exit seeking and it's not safe. The average cost is similar at $267 a day. Adult family homes in Washington have 6 beds or less, and the average cost is $200 per day. However, if you need more assistance, there will be additional fees. With in-home care, you can have all levels in the care in the home. The cost begins around $40, $45 an hour, depending upon how many levels of care you need. And of course, it depends on how many hours in a day that you need care. So it can be very expensive. As you can see, regardless of where you receive care, you need a lot of money to pay for long-term care. The combination of the cost for care and the difficulties of having a loved one who needs that kind of assistance can be very overwhelming. So how do people pay for long-term care? Well, people privately pay, people who have sufficient funds to pay for care and still be able to continue to meet their current financial responsibilities. Funds they use are 401k, IRA, 403b savings, CD stocks, all that kind of stuff. Now, many people use insurance, long-term care insurance. And in the past, traditional long-term care insurance was the only insurance option. However, today, there are new options called hybrids that combine with life insurance or annuity products, and we'd like to help people leverage their funds and use OPM or other people's money to help pay for long-term care. When the insurance benefits have been exhausted, Medicaid becomes the primary payer for long-term care. Medicaid is a state program administered by the Department of Home and Community Services. They help families who are unable to pay get services when long-term care is needed at home or in a community setting. With Medicaid paying so much of long-term care, it's an expensive burden for the government, which is why the rules to qualify for Medicaid have been implemented. In order to be eligible for Medicaid long-term care, the applicant must go through a qualification process. One of the primary requirements of this qualification process is that the applicant must have assets under a specified amount. If the assets exceed that specified amount, the applicant must spend down the assets until they reach the maximum amount allowed. The state has specific rules that determine acceptable ways that these assets can be spent down, and if you don't follow those rules, your Medicaid application will be denied. So single Medicaid applicants have an asset limit to qualify that's $2,000. While married couples in the state of Washington applying for Medicaid, the ill person is allowed $2,000. The healthy spouse is allowed $59,890 for a total of $61,890. Medicaid requires that the assets be spent down to this amount. However, there are ways to preserve assets above this amount, and we'll discuss these options later in the presentation. Now that we know what long-term care is and Medicaid's role in covering the cost of long-term care, let's discuss the most common pitfalls that we see in failing to plan for the cost of long-term care. Pitfall number one is misinformation. Sometimes that helpful advice we get from our neighbors, it's not so helpful. Advice could be incomplete, simply wrong. Every individual's journey through long-term care is unique, and what worked for one may not work for another. And so we're going to address these myths that we hear and find out what the facts are. So Medicare will pay for long-term care. That's a myth we hear. Medicare's official handbook tells us that long-term care is not a covered benefit. Well, here's why. Medicare is health insurance. It doesn't pay for custodial care. Well, this is where Medicare and Medicaid differ. Most people are confused about the difference between Medicare and Medicaid. Well, Medicare is only health insurance for when people turn 65, and some people who are ill have some sort of a illness that allows them to be on Medicare early. And Medicare's only job is to help improve our health. Medicaid, however, has many programs, and one of them does pay for long-term care once you meet the qualifications. Many think that if they served in the military, the VA will pay for their care. VA financial assistance for long-term care is called aid and attendance, and they may help pay for part of your care if you qualify. It's means tested, which means you have to financially qualify, and there is a 5-year look back. There are multiple qualifications, but what important qualification is whether or not you served during wartime. Approval can take a long time, even up to 2 years. So I often get asked, well, what if we just put our home in our child's name? Well, this is a bad idea. This is considered gifting. And gifting, transferring assets in effort to get on Medicaid can cause huge penalties. We'll go over the penalties later. Another myth is that you need to be broke to qualify for Medicaid. Well, for married couples, this is not true. We help married couples save significant amounts of their retirement assets on a regular basis. Proper legal documents are a key part of long-term care and Medicaid planning. We work closely with elder law attorneys who are experienced in Medicaid law. An elder law attorney experienced in Medicaid law will include the documents and wording needed for proper estate planning, as well as long-term care planning. Families get frustrated about paying for estate planning and then having to go back, pay attorney fees again to get the documents needed for long-term care planning. A key document is power of attorney. If you have one that's older than 2017, you should get it reviewed. The Uniform Power of Attorney Act of 2017 made changes to what must be expressly stated, such as when it's effective and the powers that are granted. Make sure that you have one for both medical and financial. With the amount of fraud out in the world today, banks and financial institutions are very cautious about accepting power of attorneys. Now, in estate planning, the typical will is what I call an I love you will, which leaves everything to the surviving spouse upon death. Well, if your spouse is on Medicaid and they inherit banking accounts, houses, and all that, they could lose their Medicaid benefits and you have to start all over. This is why we encourage families to go to elder law attorneys with knowledge in Medicaid law. There are many different kinds of trusts being used in estate planning. However, there's only one that is considered exempt for public benefits by Washington State. An experienced Medicaid attorney can determine if you need a supplemental testamentary trust that will protect the Medicaid beneficiary from losing Medicaid benefits. If a married couple owns a house and applies for Medicaid without proper Medicaid planning, the estate recovery will place a lien on the ill person's half of the house. You also need to have your community property agreements revoked if you have one of those. Pitfall number 3, not having a strategy or a plan to mitigate the cost of long-term care. 70% of people over the age of 65 will need some form of long-term care. A strategy for addressing these costs is essential. There are a variety of insurance options to cover long-term care expenses, and this is where we can leverage our own funds and use other people's money to pay for long-term care expenses. We'll discuss when it's best to use these benefits next. When your loved one needs care in a facility, it's important to know most facilities require families to privately pay for a period of time before they can transfer to Medicaid pay. Private pay periods are not a requirement of Medicaid, but are set by the facilities themselves. Your selection of a facility will determine the private pay period. Private pay periods range from no private pay up to 2 years, sometimes longer, 3, 4, I've heard up to 4. So some facilities allow for negotiation on how long a family can private pay. Long-term care policies can help meet those private pay requirements. Long-term care facilities only have a handful of beds set aside for Medicaid patients. Those beds are typically for patients that have met the 2-year private pay requirement. If a facility has 70 beds, it's possible there are 6 or 7 set aside for Medicaid patients. This is because Medicaid pays significantly less than people who privately pay for care. This causes a shortage of Medicaid beds. So if you have traditional long-term care insurance, you might have the ability to use partnership protection and be able to preserve more than what the state allows for assets when it comes to Medicaid. The Washington state asset limit to qualify for Medicaid is the $59,890 for the healthy spouse. A long-term care policy with partnership protection is one way to protect more assets. Partnership protection, it's a good rider on those traditional policies. It's a partnership between you and the state of Washington. It provides dollar-for-dollar asset protection. If you buy a long-term care policy with partnership protection that is valued at $300,000 and you use that to pay for the initial long-term care costs, once you have exhausted your long-term care policy, instead of spending the remainder of your assets down to qualify for Medicaid, you can apply for Medicaid and keep assets up to that $300,000 limit. Okay, let's move on to when you are in a crisis or you need long-term care right now. So we get phone calls weekly from families who need help immediately. Their loved one had a health event that put them in the hospital, or the family can no longer provide care at home. This is the crisis point. Their loved one is going to a facility and the facility wants them to privately pay for 24 months or more. Where will the funds come from to meet this requirement? Will they be your retirement funds? Will they be long-term care insurance? Will the family pitch in? Will it be the college funds? Where will the money come from? This is when the spend down comes to qualify for Medicaid. How can families afford to pay $8,000, $10,000, $12,000, $15,000 a month for care and still have enough money for the normal living expenses for the remainder of their lives? And many families can't. That is why they apply for Medicaid long-term care. When someone applies for Medicaid long-term care, they have to qualify both functionally and financially. There's an assessment of your ability to perform those activities of daily living and a financial review to assess your income, your resources, and your transfers. The state will complete a 5-year look back to review financial records. What they are specifically looking for are transfer of funds or resources that could have been used to pay for care. It's important to understand how the state determines your assets. Rather than using the term assets, the state uses the term resources. The state asks, what resources are available to that person that could be used to pay for care? This doesn't include your personal property. They're not going to make you have a big garage sale and sell all of your clothes and furniture. So what does the state consider a resource? Here's a list: checking, savings, IRA, trusts, land, livestock. People are always surprised that life insurance is a resource. Well, it's only a resource if it has cash value. Term life insurance is not a resource. Old, unlicensed vehicles sitting in your yard that you believe have no value are in fact a resource and will be included as part of your total resource limit. A resource is anything that can be sold in 20 days for cash. Coins in a book, like a collection, is personal property, while coins in a jar are a resource. If your Medicaid application gets denied, you're allowed to reapply, but your qualification will be delayed by at least 1 month. Every month that's delayed, you'll have to pay an additional month from your private funds. Some of the reasons for denials are having the long-term care facility apply for you. The problem with that is the intake employee at the facility is not aware of all your resources, and if they're positioned correctly, those will likely cause delays. Not providing proper documents in a timely manner can cause delays. Being over-resourced can cause delays. Here are the current standards allowed to qualify for Medicaid. So note the highlighted yellow. The healthy spouse has no income limit. This specific aspect will come into play in a few slides when we review a case study. So what happens if you're over-resourced? Well, it means spending down your assets, right? Well, not necessarily. If you do need to spend down your assets, that brings us to pitfall number 4. It's not carefully planning your spend down. Most have heard you need to spend down your assets to qualify for Medicaid. Well, this is mostly true if you're single. However, even a single person could spend down poorly and miss some opportunities if not done without a plan. When spending down to qualify for Medicaid, it should be done carefully with advice from someone who can help eliminate mistakes. When done properly, married couples can transfer assets to the healthy spouse in a way that the healthy spouse can continue to pay for living expenses. Here's an example. So we're going to talk about the spend down with a married couple who have assets above the allowed amount, the $61,890. So in our example, the male is ill first and he needs care. He worked the longest, so his Social Security and pension are much bigger than hers. When he needs long-term care, his Social Security and pension will go to pay for his care, which leaves her with only her Social Security income, and it's much less than his. The monthly expenses have not changed. Even if their house is paid off without his income, she can't stay in the home they shared for 50 years. Medicaid planning can really help this couple. Now, this couple has some assets in retirement. And if we move those assets over to her, which we can do legally, then she's in a much better financial position. So we're going to talk more about that with a case study with Bob and Ruth. Bob and Ruth have $250,000 in a savings account. Bob is in memory care and Ruth remains at home. The CSRA stands for Community Spouse Resource Allowance, or the Healthy Spouse. So the Healthy Spouse is allowed $59,890. The Ill Spouse, the ISRA is for Ill Spouse Resource Allowance, it's $2,000. So we know it's $61,890 together. So subtract that amount that they are allowed to keep from their total assets and you get $188,110. This is called the money you have saved for retirement all these years. The state wants you to use this money to spend on care, and it's called a spend down. Bob's monthly cost at memory care is $7,500. So, if Ruth pays this amount every month, their retirement funds will run out in 25 months, and Bob will now qualify for Medicaid. However, is there a better way than spending down all those retirement savings? And the answer is yes. Ruth can purchase a Medicaid compliant annuity. A Medicaid compliant annuity is an option specified by state law, spending down all the resources to qualify for Medicaid. So instead of spending all her resources down, Ruth uses the $188,110 to purchase a Medicaid compliant annuity. This is a unique type of annuity created for this specific reason. The annuity will pay $3,135.16 per month for 5 years or 60 months. The Medicaid compliant annuity has effectively turned Ruth's retirement savings into a 60-month income stream. And remember, Ruth has no limit on her income. So what is a Medicaid compliant annuity? It's an immediate annuity. It's irrevocable. It provides 60 equal monthly payments. It turns an asset into income, and the healthy spouse has no limit on her income. It names the state as the primary beneficiary if Ruth dies. So let's talk about what happens if Ruth dies. So Ruth passes away a year after the annuity is started. Medicaid has paid $36,000 from Bob's Care. So that's 12 months times $3,000 per month. The state of Washington is going to get reimbursed that money up to the date of Ruth's death, and the remainder is passed to the heirs. So many people already have annuities and wonder if those annuities will work for Medicaid. The answer is, unless it's a restricted SPIA, it will not qualify. The funds will remain an asset and will prevent the applicant from qualifying. So I meet with clients that have financial advisors who want to write this annuity. But if your financial advisor does not have experience with Medicaid compliant annuities, and the deadlines and proper annuity language required by the Department of Health and Family Services for these restricted SPIAs, I would not recommend that they learn on my client's behalf. Remember, delaying leads to denials and additional facility costs. We are trained advisors and write these restricted annuities all the time. So it's important to understand state Medicaid laws were not written to impoverish both spouses just because one needs care. All right, let's move on to pitfall number 5. Gifting. Many grandparents love to help their grandchildren help them pay for college or give them a car when they graduate. These gifts are wonderful when grandparents are healthy. However, they can cause penalties when one needs long-term care. So, how much can you gift in any one month? The answer is $367 in any one month. This is not an arbitrary number. It is the average of 1 day of privately paying for care in the state of Washington. There are a few ways to protect or transfer assets and still avoid penalties. For example, transferring your home to your child who has provided your care for over 2 years, a sibling who has a financial interest in the home, or a caregiver contract with a family member. Each of these requirements have a set of rules that go with them, so be careful. The Estate Recovery Act is the thing that is most feared by people when it comes to applying for Medicaid. It allows the state to recover the costs they have paid for someone's long-term care expenses. However, if planned properly, a married couple can avoid the Estate Recovery Act, and single folks also have a couple options to avoid. So I'm going to tell you about a case study. Mrs. J was married to a prominent attorney in her town. They had a nice house and owned a building that her husband had practiced law in, and then he developed Alzheimer's. There came a point where she could no longer care for him, and her CPA told her she's going to run out of money. She'd sold the commercial building to help pay for care, and as a result, the capital gains led to a few unintended consequences. Her income increased, her Social Security checks plummeted, her Medicare premiums increased. That's when she called me. We were able to get the remainder of her assets into an annuity, and she qualified for Medicaid. Mrs. Y was a young wife, only 67 years old, and had already paid over $200,000 for her husband's care in a facility. She believed that she would continue to pay $12,000 a month until he passed. At that rate, she'd run out of money. She was likely to live 20 more years. So we moved her remaining retirement assets into a Medicaid compliant annuity, and her husband qualified for Medicaid. So this is Mr. L. We met 2 years ago, and I was interviewing him and asking him about his resources during our consultation, as I found out that he had close to 30 vehicles at his house that were his. He had sold 2 homes and had 2 promissory notes from the sale of the residential property and a 3rd oceanfront property that he had transferred to his son. Well, remember, only 1 vehicle is exempt, and the total value of the remaining vehicles is applied to that resource limit. The promissory notes had to be sold. His wife's facility had a 2-year private pay period, so he spent that time selling his extra vehicles and worrying about Medicaid qualification. We're able to get all of his issues taken care of, and he was qualified for Medicaid. If you have no assets, you can qualify immediately. Everyone else needs a plan. We create written qualification plans for every client. This helps keep the process running as smooth as possible. It's important because the state financial case managers are overworked, each one handling over 500 clients. Managing expectations with clients is a big part of the plan. And that's the end of our webinar today. We help people all over the state of Washington. We have a few offices that we can meet in person. We also do Zoom and phone appointments. Thanks for coming today. Have a great day.